Hi, so another Mrs. H Psychology revision video. This is for paper 2, the approaches section, and it is a comparison question. So if they give you outline and discuss differences, for example, this one from the mock exam, outline the cognitive approach to psychology, discuss one or more differences with at least one other approach. Okay, so this video explains how to combine comparison with evaluation. We first of all have to do an outline of AO1. Okay, so outline the cognitive approach. And here is what we need to do with a question like this, where they're asking you to outline one particular approach, but then discuss differences or discuss limitations or whatever. This one is discuss differences. So what you need to do, first of all, is you outline the key factors of the cognitive approach first, AO1. Pick another approach and make comparison 1. Do not describe the second approach. They don't want that. Okay, so it's not a full description of the second approach, but what you're trying to do is use that comparison point with the two approaches to explain an evaluation of the cognitive, making sure you're explaining why, the particular point is good or bad for the cognitive approach. And then you just continue in that same way, repeat C with the comparison 2, continue, etc., etc. So you should also be trying to, wherever you can, bring in some references of research. So let's have a look at this, starting with our AO1. So I'm going to explain these AO1s, just got them listed here. So just pause the video whenever you and repeat it so you can pick up on anything. Okay, here we go. So there are other points that you could include, but I'm just going to go through some very key terminology and key, very specific points about the cognitive approach. So first of all, cognitive approach focuses on the mediational processes between stimulus and response. In other words, the organism and the SOR. Secondly, we would say these examples of these mediational processes are language, problem solving, for example. And here the focus is on the internal processes. So behavior is influenced by both conscious and unconscious thoughts. So the focus here is on these internal cognitive thought processes. Okay, it focuses on the internal thought process, uses models to explain these processes. For example, we could bring in one example like the multi-store model, which outlines how memory works through sensory, short-term and long-term memory stores. Okay, as an example of a model. We would also want to bring in the key term, the use of schemas. So we might say something like that it likens the mind to a computer in the sense that information is picked up as stimuli, then it's processed in some form, for example, combined with previous experience, knowledge from memory. And in other words, this is an opportunity for schema. So previous schema being mental representations of experience and knowledge. And then we make an output. And our output is the response that we would make. In other words, the behavior that we would make. So the next point, objective internal processes. So unlike the psychodynamic approach, which also focuses on internal processes that determine behavior, cognitive approach looks at these internal processes objectively, providing testable hypotheses which can be replicated, for example. Okay, just sort of developing that point. And we would like to bring in here cognitive neuroscience. So most recently, the cognitive approach has been combined with biological knowledge to produce cognitive neuroscience. And this is the newest paradigm. This is the newest area of research. So we've highlighted some of the key AO1s. There are others that you could include, but that just covers some because we need to then move on to our AO3. So moving on to AO3, our evaluation. Okay, remember we're going to evaluate and make these comparisons all in one. So here we go. So we might use a term like mechanical, and we say, however, this approach can be criticized as being rather mechanical and ignoring the social and cultural factors that affect our behavior. For example, social desirability, wanting to look good in some way, that would influence our behaviors, even to the point that we make irrational decisions. And that is different to a rational robotic computer. So, for example, the theory of planned behavior and addiction, the addiction topic says we might know logically our addictive behavior is bad for us. We might even have the intention to change, but that doesn't mean we actually make the necessary changes. So comparing it to a computer is quite mechanical, and it ignores factors that influence humans quite differently. We might also say the key point would be objectivity versus subjectivity. So models that infer processes. It's also criticized for using these models to infer cognitive processes, used because we can't actually observe these at work. And so these models are criticized as a bit of and this inference is a leap too far. And in comparison, the behaviorists may be seen as more objective and therefore better because they, remember, focus on only overt observable behaviors, which are worthy of study. So the more objectivity gives more opportunity for replication, also falsification, so it has more scientific credibility. Continuing on with this theme. So although the behaviourists would agree with the cognitive use of scientific lab experiments because of their emphasis on rigid controls over variables, others would criticise this as being very artificial in their testing process. For example, let's say memory. Learning lists of trigrams or lists of words really lacks mundane realism, so it does limit its validity and its generalisability. The humanists, on the other hand, will oppose this. They reject a scientific approach to studying human behaviour. They believe our uniqueness means we should be looking at the subjective view of the person. Remember that word, phenomenology. So lab experiments of a cognitive approach should be replaced with subjective case studies in which the focus is on understanding the unique individual rather than looking at how many people, for example, behave in a particular way. Okay, so going on to soft determinism as another key comparison. On the other hand, praise comes for the cognitive approach from their acceptance of soft determinism, meaning that although individuals would go through the same processes, they can reject stimuli at will and they're free from coercion and constraint. In other words, instead of merely responding to stimuli as the behaviourists believe with their environmental determinism, the cognitive approach believe as individuals we decide what we want to pay attention to, we decide what we recall. So this soft determinism also differs from the biological approach's biological determinism. In other words, that many behaviours are predetermined in our genes, our hormones, our brain structures. The biological approach would also reject the view that all behaviour occurs from internal processes. And indeed, there is evidence to support this biological view. So I should say they reject the internal cognitive processes, I should say. So there is evidence to support the biological view. So we can't ignore so much biological evidence. You know, one example might be atypical chromosome patterns and that determine behaviour, or gender behaviour, and SDN, sexual dimorphic nucleus, brain structures in the brain that influence gender identity. Or indeed, in another topic, addiction, let's say the influence of dopamine levels on nicotine addiction, you know, with the nicotine regulation model. So this, of course, completely is rejected by the humanistic view of free will, that we're all unique individuals and have complete free will in our behaviours. And therefore, for example, we're completely responsible for making changes to our behaviour. Okay, so we could bring in different approaches there with the deterministic views. And going on to perhaps a more positive view of cognitive approach. So, and still combining and comparing with other approaches. So let's focus on this scientific standpoint. Cognitive is seen as a scientific approach. In other words, scientific to studying these internal processes. So it's objective, it's reliable, it has credibility in comparison to other approaches. For example, the humanists, with their focus on the subjective experiences. And the humanists believe that the subjective experiences are more important than objective reality, in other words, phenomenology. So the cognitive approach will still have more scientific credibility along with, let's say, the behaviourists with their very scientific methods as well, very objective methods. Inferences, let's focus on this. Inferences, so the cognitive approach has to allow for inferences because cognitive mediational processes until recently have not been able to be directly observed. So these inferences and models of the processes can provide more insight into internal cognitive processes, which then can lead to more objective testing. Most recently, though, the cognitive neuroscience approach has meant that some of these processes are becoming directly observable. For example, Peterson's work on scanning techniques like the PET scans and MRI scans. So these scanning techniques to observe, for example, Broca Broca's area being lit up when there's a reading task, and Wernicke's area being highlighted when there's a listening task going on with participants. So, the inferences are being overtaken with some more scientific research, but they are still a stepping stone. They are an opportunity to explore further these internal processes. And finally, we might end up with something like idiographic versus nomothetic. So in terms of this debate, the idiographic nomothetic debate, the cognitive approach covers both nomothetic research, in other words, finding general laws to apply to people. So, for example, the principles of memory models like multi-store, but they'll also use idiographic individual data like case studies, for example, HM and KF. So this is just a really quick run through of the sort of material that you could introduce, and trying to show you how to do the comparisons, but also include the evaluation of the cognitive at the same time. So I hope that's useful. If it is, please do either like it or subscribe. That gives me some feedback as to whether these are useful for you. And obviously, if there are any constructive comments, anything you think could help, please do comment on it. That'd be great. Thank you very much.